Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Chloe Green, coming from the Maryland Center for History and Culture. I am the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here, and we're happy to welcome you all today to the Miller History Fund Applicant webinar with our wonderful Vice President, David Belew. So today we're going to be going through, or David is going to go through exactly the application process with everyone who has either applied or applied. And I don't want to say too much about it because David is the expert, but I will be here in the background. I will be sending some information through the chat as we go, but otherwise, David, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you, and we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thanks so much, Chloe, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is David Belew, and I'm Vice President of Grants and Government Affairs at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. We're really excited for this fiscal year 2023 grant round of the Miller History Fund. We have some exciting changes that we're going to be talking about throughout this webinar. And I just want to know that this is being recorded. So for folks that aren't able to make this meeting, or if you want to share this with a colleague, either within or outside your institution, we'll be sharing a link of this webinar on the webpage and then also emailing it to everyone who registered. If you feel like introducing yourself in the chat and saying where you're from, please feel free to do so. And you can also be asking questions throughout the session through the Q&A feature on the webinar. I'm going to try and concentrate most questions towards the end of the presentation, but if there's any clarity issues or things that pop up, I'll be working with Chloe to address that as we move along. I think that today should take about, we budgeted the whole hour for this talk. I think that it should take about 45 minutes or so to talk about all the details of everything. This is just the beginning. I'm always available for consultation calls, and we'll talk about other ways that you can ask questions or engage between now and the application deadline. I'll start off with introducing our organization. We're the Maryland Center for History and Culture. You might have known us as the Maryland Historical Society, which had been our name since 1844. We're the oldest continuously operating cultural institution in the state of Maryland, and we steward the largest collection of Maryland history and culture, inclusive of about 350,000 objects, artworks, and pieces of material culture, and 7 million books, documents, and manuscripts that try and tell the whole history of Maryland. We're based in Baltimore City, but we do programming and educational work in all 23 counties plus the city. Let's see. We've been operating the Miller History Fund since 2019. It was enacted by the late Senate President Emeritus Mike Miller in the 2018 legislative session and passed into law. So these are state funds, and we take that matter very seriously. It's designated from the Preservation of Cultural Arts Fund, and we take some for administration, and we grant out about $200,000 a year to peer historical institutions. We're really committed to listening to feedback from potential applicants, feedback from people who've gotten the award, and we're committed to continually evaluating this program and refining it so we can make sure that it meets the needs of the sector, which is a good segue into some of the changes we're going to talk about. So over the past 3 funding cycles, we've been able to award $600,000 to 33 different organizations in 16 different Maryland counties. They've typically fallen within 3 different categories: resource development and strategic planning, collections, care and access, and audience development. That's sort of the 3 buckets of capacity building that are eligible for this grant program, and we'll unpack a bit more what capacity building means later on in the chat. We usually receive about 30 to 35 applications and make 10 to 12 grants per cycle. So there's about a 30% success rate for those who try and apply to the grant. Over the past 3 funding cycles, obviously there's myriad different types of heritage organizations in the state of Maryland. About 42% of all grants have gone to historical collecting institutions, museums, archives, historical societies. 42% of grants have gone to stewards of architectural heritage, and that can be very broad to include community development corporations and other types of neighborhood development nonprofits, and natural heritage, anything from land conservancies to arboretums. So this past summer, we figured we'd been operating the grant program for 3 years. It was a good time to take a step back and look at the intentionality of the program, if we were really making the impact that we wanted to make in the sector. Keeping in mind that this is a relatively small amount of funding in comparison to a lot of the other funding opportunities that are available both from the state and from some of the private funders that work in Maryland. We did a large public survey that started over the summer and was open for about 6 weeks. Tried to advertise it as best we could on all the different social media channels that our sector uses. We have a contact list of about 400 different organizations and peers that we sent the survey to, and we also tried to work with different nonprofit leaders and other stakeholders, such as the heritage area directors, to get the word out. Ultimately, 49 participants completed the survey. We were really happy that they represented all 23 Maryland counties and Baltimore City. We asked a series of different questions, and we'll look at some of the bigger takeaways later on in the chat. And it's something that we hope to build on as an organization. We'd like to continue to conduct surveys on the state of the field, especially with an eye towards collecting institutions. And it's a longer term goal to publish some of the results of those surveys and reports. Another thing that we were happy about with this survey was that we weren't just talking to folks who had worked with the Miller History Fund. Obviously a big part of the survey was geared towards applicant experience, but we also wanted to hear from folks that might have never heard of the program, might have not applied for a variety of reasons. So we collected information on that as well. And ultimately about 41% of respondents had no direct experience with the program. So obviously it's great to have more survey participants, but we're happy that we had a nice sort of representative pool to look at. So some high level takeaways from the survey. 71% of folks identified historical collections and museums as the cultural resource in Maryland most in need of funding. The way that question was framed was sort of going back to that breakdown of different types of applicants: architectural heritage, natural heritage, and historical collections. It was a mix of folks who either identified historical collections as the most urgently needed resource that needs attention. Some folks had more specific recommendations like community museums, community archives, small collecting institutions. We'll talk a bit more about the evaluation process for the Miller History Fund, but 97% of participants agreed that our use of third-party panelists, inclusive of both Marylanders and experts from other surrounding states, was a fair and transparent process. And 94% of folks strongly agreed that the time and information required of the grant was appropriate for the size of the award and the likelihood of success. All that being said, we did continue to make some efforts to streamline the application, and we'll talk about that soon. So using that data, using one-on-one conversations that I frequently have with grantees and applicants, and then having an internal deliberation with MCHC staff, thinking about our limited resources, the limited amount of funding, and how we want to cultivate and grow this program over the coming years. We made the decision to really prioritize this grant program on historical collecting institutions. So that could be museums, historical societies, archives, really any nonprofit for whom historical collection stewardship is a primary aspect of their mission. And even most historic sites or heritage sites that you might think are primarily about the architecture. Many of them also steward important historical collections that help tell the story of their site, and we want to support that work as well. So we have a very broad definition of what constitutes an historical collecting institution. We just want to make sure that it really is like a primary aspect of your mission. Another change that we made is we would, thinking about refining this focus, we also wanted to broaden the pool to include some smaller subunits and public agencies that steward historical collections that might have a very small budget. So we broadened the pool to include, museums that are operated by a university, public agencies that steward an archive. The criteria for this is going to be on a case-by-case basis and based on a conversation with myself, but it's still ensuring that we're directing funding towards organizations that have a relatively smaller budget, and we're defining that as under $2 million. So if you're a department at a university, if you're a public archive operated by a county, and you have a budget under $2 million, you're likely eligible to apply. And I would just recommend that you would schedule a consultation call with me first. The other thing that we'll talk more about later is we're hoping to use this program to inspire folks to start thinking about the semi-quincentennial, it's a mouthful, of the American Revolution in 2026. So that's the 250th anniversary of American independence. Some important dates for the grant program, and we'll break down the different phases of this application process soon. We published all of the guidelines and materials on October 3rd of this month. November 11th at midnight, letter of intent is due. December 9th, the full application is due. And then we anticipate making award announcements towards the end of January, if everything goes well. And the grant period for our FY23 cycle is going to begin in April. We covered some of this earlier in the conversation. Going back to the notion that we have an intentionally broad definition of what constitutes historical collections. We were looking at other federal funders, other state funders. Specifically, we looked at the definition that the National Endowment for Humanities provides for historical collections and some other grant programs. So that could be books and manuscripts, photographs, sound recordings and moving images, archaeological and ethnographic artifacts, art, historical objects, and material culture. The real sticking point for us here is that it has to have a connection to the diverse history and culture of Maryland. We're looking more at the intent behind collecting rather than a timestamp. If an applicant is doing a contemporary oral history project and saving those digital recordings, even that, given the fact that those are being collected in 2022, we would still consider that to be an historical collection. Something that would be excluded might be, a large contemporary art collection that features artists from all over the country that might not necessarily have a strong connection to the history of Maryland. We talked a bit earlier about the new inclusion of some public agencies and subunits of bigger orgs. And then just going back to that point that we really want to support Maryland's heritage community, and you must be primarily located in Maryland, and your audience should primarily be Marylanders for you to be eligible to apply. Or given the fact that this is a relatively small amount of funding and we are trying to make a statewide impact, we're trying to support projects in every Maryland county. We want to spread the love and spread the wealth. So we ask that organizations that have previously gotten a Miller History Grant or are currently actively managing one would wait a minimum of one grant cycle after the conclusion of their awarded period to reapply. So for reference, if you're a past Miller History Fund grantee, and let's say your project concluded in this past May, you have to wait until this grant period is over. You would be eligible to reapply in the FY 2024 grant cycle. So some examples of eligible projects, going back to that broad definition of capacity building. We're not changing our definition of capacity building, even given this new focus on collecting institutions. We do anticipate that we'll support more collections care projects, more digitization projects, more things that make Maryland's historical collections accessible to the public and better cared for. But we're still going to be supporting marketing initiatives, strategic planning, professional development for staff and volunteers. If you want to do a feasibility study for a fundraising project, if you're trying to develop a really great series of programming that you think is going to bring a different type of audience into your doors, we would encourage you to think critically about that and apply. An example I use when we're talking about what's capacity building versus what is a more discrete project is, we wouldn't be interested in necessarily conserving one item in your collection. That's a valuable project, but it's not necessarily going to be raising or building the overall capacity of your organization to steward for all of its collections over time. A more attractive project that would be more supportive of our capacity building goals would be, a project that looks at your collections care and climate for everything, or looks at your collections care policy, something that's going to have more of a broad impact on the ability of your organization to be sustainable over time and to care for its collections over time. I see we have a question in the chat. So if I'm happy to talk about this one-on-one with anyone, but we ask that people who have had a past Miller History Fund grant wait for one complete grant cycle to transpire after the conclusion of their own grant period. So if you got a grant in recent years and it concluded this past May, for example, you wouldn't be eligible to apply until this complete FY23 grant cycle concludes. So you'd be eligible to reapply in FY24. I hope that makes sense, and it probably could be phrased a little more intelligibly. So an example of ineligible projects, capacity building projects for an organization that isn't a collecting institution. Capital projects, there's lots of much more substantive grant opportunities out there that can support capital work. And then capital planning projects that are not directly related to collection, storage, facilities, and care. So obviously our ability to care for our collections is intrinsically tied to the hardware we have, to the environment we're providing our materials and archives. We want to support planning work that can advance that, but not necessarily planning work that doesn't have a direct collections care component. And general operating support requests are also not supported by this grant program. None of the things that we talked about here are a exhaustive list. We want to have a conversation with you if you think that you might be in the gray area. So don't hesitate again to reach me by email and try and set up a consultation call. And that's also part of the reason that we have the letter of intent process, so we can have a check there. So we make 10 to 12 awards per year. The award maximum is $20,000 and the award minimum is $10,000. We don't require any matching funds. And while we don't support general operating support requests, we will support staff time in the amount of up to 25% of awarded funds. So if you got a $10,000 award, you could designate $2,500 of that to supporting your existing staff salaries. I'm going to stop the share right now and just show you our main landing page for the Miller History Fund, which is really your one-stop shop for everything. mdhistory.org/about/Miller-history-fund is your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about the Miller History Fund grant program. I'll be sharing the link with everybody after this, and it's also in a lot of the emails that we'll be sending for registrants to this program. you can find a list of all the past award winners of the program. It's where you can find the grant guidelines, a draft application, the budget template that we're going to ask you to use, and also a link to the submittable platform. Important dates, after this presentation is over, we're going to be posting a recording of this workshop to this website so folks can access it here. And then what I always want to encourage people to do is this button right here and signing up for the Miller History Fund email. Your first step for getting into the Miller History Fund grant program is making sure that you submit that letter of intent. It's not supposed to be burdensome. It's really just a tool for us to establish baseline eligibility for the organization. And it helps us start planning and building out our grant panel teams earlier in the process so we can have a quicker turnaround time once applications are all submitted. That's going to be due November 11th, and it shouldn't take any applicant more than 10 minutes to complete. And we're not going to reject any letters of intent unless they're clearly outside of the spirit of the grant program and they're clearly not supporting any of our guidelines or focus areas. So it's really just establishing, do you meet the budget thresholds that we talked about? Have you been a nonprofit for at least a year? Are you permanently located in Maryland? And you have to check every single box in order to be able to submit the letter of intent. So once you submit the letter of intent, you'll get an automatic email from the submittable system. That's going to give you a link to the full application. You're going to see this email that's going to be sent. You should check your spam filter because it's going to be automated from submittable, and it'll give you access to the full application. You can always jump back into the full application by clicking on this link. And then once you save it in the submittable system, you can always access it again in your drafts and save proposals. So here's what the full application looks like. We listened to feedback from the survey process and tried to eliminate some duplicative questions. So you're not trying to retype the same information that you've already provided earlier in the proposal. Just basic contact information. This project summary here is just 150 words, and that's what we're going to be using if you are selected for funding. Just try and design that so it's a good tool for the panelists and for myself to have like a very high level bird's eye view of what your project is in a few sentences. The funding request, you can't request more than 20,000 and less than 10. We limited some of the word counts to make them smaller this year. Some feedback that we got from previous applicants is that they like having the space, but it can be tempting sometimes and you end up spending too much time in any one section. So we're trying to encourage folks to be as efficient as they can with their language. This first section is really just like a bird's eye overview of who your organization is, what type of activities you do throughout the year, and how you're managed. We're interested in governance. The audience section is one that got significantly streamlined from last year. We took out a whole section of this. We just ask for how many people you think benefit from your organization's services every year, and just give us a little bit of information on how you came up with that number in this audience tracking section. We're interested in supporting, audience-driven programming, audience-driven strategic planning for the organization. So any information you can provide on how you're trying to be a responsive organization to the community you hope to serve is really beneficial for the panelists. The project section, that's where you're really going to be getting into the nuts and bolts of how you think the project's going to progress over your 2-year grant period. Your project can't start anytime before April 1st, 2023, and it has to end April 1st of 2025. You have 2 years to complete the initiative that we're going to be funding through the program. So we're interested in how are you going to be managing the project? What are the specific sort of benchmarks throughout the 2 years where you're going to check in and see, all right, maybe we're going to be starting the second phase. Maybe this is our opportunity to end data collection and start implementing some of the work that we hope to do. And we're also interested in like what discrete products are you going to be creating as a result of your project? And that could be a variety of things. It could be a marketing initiative. It could have a series of different advertisements or reports from different audience surveys that you might have done. We're just interested in you breaking that down and really sharing with us what the output of your project is going to be. Project outcomes, it's helpful to distinguish the difference between that and the deliverables. So the deliverables is like the thing that you can hold, right? It's like the report. It's the new exhibition interpretive plan you might have developed. The outcomes are really asking, how is this project going to truly build the capacity of your organization over time? How are you going to be a different type of place as a result of this project? For the project budget, going back to the main landing page for Miller History Fund, we just ask that you use that template that we provided. Budget justification, just sharing, why you think that all these different expenses are important to your grant project. Sharing with us why you think that those costs are reasonable. And then budget supporting documents. We don't necessarily require quotes or estimates for everything that you're going to do. They're helpful and it can make your project more competitive than other applicants if you already have those estimates. And if you've done a good job earlier of describing why you think that those costs are reasonable. If you don't have an estimate yet, if you haven't been able to secure that with a potential vendor, we would just ask that you maybe share like what your RFP is going to be, right? But what's your search and selection process going to be for choosing the best contractor for your project? This is just some general organizational documents that we ask you submit as a part of your application. We don't have a required format that we ask anyone to fill out. It's your current annual operating budget, the budget for the previous year, resumes for project members, and then if you're working with a partner organization or a consultant, we just ask that you share a letter of commitment that shows that they're willing and able to participate in the grant project should it be funded. You can add up to 5 supporting materials, and that's just anything that you want to throw in to show the panelists what your organization is all about. A strategic plan, perhaps a calendar of the events that you offer throughout the year. And that is the application. I'm going to pull back up the PowerPoint presentation and we can talk a little bit about the evaluation process. So one thing I like to stress with everybody is that, MCHC is a nonprofit museum, just like everybody else that's likely on the call. And we like to partner with organizations, like to partner with grantees. And really important to that and to running this grant program is ensuring that there's no conflict of interest. MCHC facilitates the grant program and we design some of the criteria working with other stakeholders, but no MCHC staff are part of the scoring process. We recruit and pay different grant panelists, both from Maryland and from surrounding states to be part of this process. We typically try and group panelists around content expertise. So we'll have a different panel that's working on marketing and advancement proposals than the one that might be working on collections, care, and digitization. We try and recruit folks from like states. So we look at the Mid-Atlantic region, Virginia, New Jersey, other folks that can share everything that they know from what their state is doing in the heritage sector. but still have a kind of a good understanding of the dynamics in Maryland. And then usually about 40%, 30 to 40% of all the panelists are Maryland folks. Panelists have to look at the pool of applicants that they're going to be reviewing in their panel. And if there's any type of conflict of interest, they have to disclose that. And we usually ask that they, if it constitutes a true conflict of interests, they recuse themselves from that scoring process. So the evaluation criteria is in the guidelines, and we have 5. So heritage value, clarity, urgency, expertise, and sustainability. I realized that's actually 6. So thanks for bearing with me. Heritage value is a very broad umbrella. We just ask that you share with the panel what you believe the social and academic value of the historical collections you steward are to Maryland's history and culture, and to your immediate community. Is the resource that you're talking about actually central to your mission? And have you demonstrated the extent to which these collections are relevant and accessible to all Marylanders or those in the community that you're trying to serve? Clarity, that's just the nuts and bolts of your application. Is the project time period that you're describing easy to understand? Are you clear about who's doing what on the project? Does the budget make sense? It's just, it helps the panelists if the proposal is written in a clear and succinct way that they can easily understand. We're not judging you on the quality of your writing per se. We're not expecting all applicants to be novelists or creative writers. And that's not what the criteria really supports. It's just, do they understand what you're trying to do? Urgency, is the proposed project time sensitive? Is it leveraging an upcoming anniversary? Is it required as soon as possible to save your organization or stabilize a collection? This really just comes into play. We often encourage applicants to reapply in a future cycle if they don't get it the first time, but there are some cases where a project has to happen in the upcoming year, and we give special consideration to those. Has the applicant demonstrated for impact how the project increases your capacity to carry out your mission? That's really going back to that outcomes piece that we were talking about earlier in the presentation. How is this going to make you a better steward of your historical collection and better empowered to share that collection with the public? We do give special consideration to projects that encourage cross-organizational collaboration in the sector and things that are replicable in the sector. So that would be favorable in the impact section if something supported that. Expertise, that can be defined in a lot of ways. One thing that we like this grant program to do is to empower applicants to look outside of their organization for expertise that they might not have on staff. And we really encourage folks to work with consultants, work with specialists in their field so they can get that outside perspective. But expertise doesn't necessarily mean, someone that has a graduate degree in museum studies. It could be someone who really knows the community you're hoping to serve quite well, or just has a lot of local knowledge that you might not have internally. So that's going to play into the roles and responsibility section of the proposal, and then all the resumes and letters of commitment you'll be submitting. Just letting the panelists know that everyone on the team is qualified and prepared to do the project. Sustainability, just wanting to make sure that this isn't a flash in the pan project, that it's really going to give your organization better tools over time. And the other piece, while we are not giving automatic points or requiring matching funds, if the applicant can show that they have other resources that they're contributing to the proposal just outside of this funding or just outside of consultants they might pay for, if you can show that you have a robust network of volunteers that are going to be supporting the project, or if you have cash reserves that are also sort of amplifying the grant, that can play well into the sustainability section. So this year, there are a few changes to the bonus points. Part of the goal of the Miller History Fund is to have a statewide impact and to support projects that might necessarily be receiving other funds. So we do give priority to those organizations that are operating outside of Maryland's heritage area system. You can go on the MHT, the Maryland Historical Trust website, and look at the heritage area program. It's a great program. There's 13 different areas around the state. And it's currently one of the more robust sources of funding for public history projects and museums. But there are lots of organizations outside of those boundaries that aren't eligible for those state funds. So we give special consideration to them. And then counties that, or organizations that are operating in a county that have not yet received a Miller History Fund grant. So I mentioned earlier that we've funded projects in 13 different counties. There's some that haven't quite gotten there yet. So this year we'll be giving some special consideration to organizations that are in Allegheny, Calvert, Cecil, Charles, Garrett, Kent, Queen Anne's, Somerset, Talbot, and Wacomico counties. For the geographic reach bonus point section, you can receive a maximum of 2 points. So let's say you're in Garrett County and you're outside of a heritage area, you can get up to 2 points in this section. The new thing this year is the special consideration given to projects that support Maryland's semi-quincentennial commemoration in 2026. After this presentation's over, I will share some resources you can look at on some of the planning that's already underway at the national level. We want to support organizations that are either planning for the commemoration, looking at different audience building strategies they could start now leading up to 2026. And we also want to support projects that better steward or make accessible early American collections, which we're defining as anything predating 1830. Just thinking that this is a special opportunity to bring awareness to these collections and the fact that they are approaching in some cases 250 to 300 years in age, that they are in particular need of digitization and care. So if you get a perfect score in all 6 evaluation categories, and you get bonus points both for the geographic reach section and for the support of the 250th anniversary, you can get a total of 34 points for a perfect score. Awardees will be determined based on a scoring curve. It's very rare that any organization gets a perfect score, and the top 10 to 12 organizations will receive funding. It usually just sort of comes down to how much an organization is requesting. If every organization that is in the top 10 requests $20,000, we'll only support 10 organizations, but usually the funding requests are somewhere in between, and we're able to support anywhere from 11 to 12 organizations each year. I want to leave time now for questions. So please feel free to drop any questions in the chat, and let's see. I see Chris is asking if we can expand a little bit on what outcomes we're looking for with oral histories. I would just ask if you could follow up with me after this meeting, and we can talk about it one-on-one. When we do support programming or active collecting, such as what you might be describing, we really want to see that it's helping build your audience, right? So oral history collecting or public program that might be part of your regular calendar of events is might not necessarily fall under the umbrella of capacity building. But if this oral history project or programming initiative is going to bring new people into your door, that's an outcome that the panelists typically respond very well to. So some of the other resources that informed our process in refining the program, and I think might be helpful for grantees. If this is the first time you're thinking about the semi-quincentennial in 2026, I would really encourage you to look at the American Association of State and Local Histories Making 250 Field Guide. And this link will be shared as part of the slideshow with everyone on the call. This commemoration in 2026 is going to be different than the 1976 commemoration. Most stakeholders are really committed to a really inclusive and diverse look at the ongoing American experiment. So a lot of different types of work and types of project could fall under that umbrella, not necessarily just those things that are interpreting the era of 1776. For example, Maryland's 250 Commission is taking a really expansive approach that's looking at lots of different game-changing moments in Maryland history, leading up to where we are today. So that focus and that care doesn't necessarily exclude programming and commemorative planning that falls outside of that 18th century period. The Institute Museum and Library Services Heritage Health Information Survey, that's some of the most recent data that we have that looks at the state of historical collections all over the country. And it's a really perilous situation. So many historical societies and museums that care for these really important and irreplaceable cultural resources don't have the funding or the capacity to care for them, to ensure that they're preserved for future generations. And just because they're a cultural resource that might be, in a file cabinet or in a library doesn't mean that they're any less important or impactful to the sector as some of the more, visible things that we see. So it's a great report, and I think that there's some new work underway at the national level to sort of update it. I think the most recent stuff is from 2019. And then the Maryland Museums Association webpage, it's a group of different folks who work at museums all over the state, trying to create professional development resources for other stakeholders. And there's a lot of really great state level reports that they've included on that website, different studies in the museum and historical collections field that have been conducted by the Maryland Historical Trust over the years and others. So it's a really great tool, and I think there's been a lot more activity on the website in the past couple of months than there had been. Yes, we will be emailing the PowerPoint presentation to all attendees, probably some point towards the end of the week. So someone's asking what to do if you have a previous budget because you're brand new. So one thing I want to stress is that if to apply for this grant, you have to have maintained that nonprofit status for at least 1 year. So any expenses you incurred in that first year of your nonprofit operation, I would recommend including those. But if you truly don't have a previous year budget, I'd recommend reaching out to me, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. What I want to stress to everybody is I'm here, I'm accessible. If you shoot me an email, I'll probably get back to you within the next business day. I'm trying to schedule 30-minute consultation calls with everyone. So don't hesitate to reach out. So someone asked, capital projects aren't allowed, but can the funds be used for capital project assessment? We're not as interested in supporting straight up capital planning because a lot of that work can be supported by some of the more robust capital programs that are already offered by the state that are, providing much larger dollar amounts, either through the Department of Housing and Community Development or the Maryland Historical Trust's capital grant program. The type of capital work that we will fund is planning and assessment specifically for collections care. So if you're looking at, the climate situation where you keep some of your materials, if you're looking at a new shelving solution for some of your archival works and things of that nature, we are interested in supporting that. And I'm happy to talk more about that in detail with anybody one-on-one. All right, so we have one more. Asking about a larger display from the 1976 bicentennial. I would need some more information to talk about that, about how you're hoping to use it. But it seems intriguing. I'm personally very interested in how the commemoration has changed since the past 50 years, and evaluating what we did then and sort of integrating that into this upcoming commemoration. So I'd love to hear more about it one-on-one. Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone. And we'll be publishing this on the website, and don't hesitate to reach out to me. Chloe?
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, David, so much for taking time today to help our applicants who came in. We have plugged the grants email in the chat. If anybody has questions after the webinar, I know I'm one of those people who's always like got questions when it's done. I will be sending our remaining important dates for the grant in the chat right now. So make sure to refer to those. And then David will be sending the PowerPoint along with other links out after, like he said. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you again, David. Hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day. Good luck.